Hello once again, everyone. It's Mr. B, and we are finally finishing Chapter 11 today. So we're going to be finishing with the last two modules, which are 11.4 and 11.5. And if we look on the review guide, there are just 3 more things that you will need to know from this video for the next exam. So let's get into it. And there's going to be a fun activity that we're going to do, but not in this video. Alright. So we've already talked about the psychodynamic, the trait perspective, and the social cognitive perspective. Now we're going to talk about the humanistic perspective of personality. And then finally, now that we've explained all these different ways, we're going to talk about a few ways that we actually test for personality. But let's talk about the humanistic perspective first. So the thing that you will need to know about the humanistic perspective is actually what you also needed to know way back on the first exam. And it's kind of the 2 researchers best known for the humanistic perspective. And one of them is Carl Rogers. And so he had the kind of self theory. And it was emphasis on the self. It was looking at, who you want to be and how we can get there. And so he had ideas and concepts of unconditional positive regard versus conditional positive regard. So unconditional positive regard is used a lot of times in therapy, and it's the whole idea that no matter what a person does or says, you treat them in a positive way. You are there to help them. Versus, conditional positive regard, where, they'll treat you in a positive way, if they treat you, you get treated in a positive way, or if they do something, there's conditions. But Carl Rogers was all about having that unconditioned positive regard, which goes with the whole idea also of person-centered therapy. So it was all about just putting the self at the center of personality. Like, who are you? Let's do some role playing and figure out, who you are and who you want to be. The other name that you will need to know for the sake of the exam, which we've also talked about, actually, I believe in the last chapter, or when we talked about motivation, but Abraham Maslow. And so he had the hierarchy of needs, and he's also the humanistic perspective. And so it's the whole idea when we're looking at personality is the way that you are presenting yourself has to do with, the certain needs that you have to have met. And so, as we've mentioned before, it starts at the very bottom with the physiological needs, and then safety, love and belonging, esteem, and then finally self-actualization. And the goal is to meet all of those needs so you can make it to that self-actualization. And then you really know who you are, what your true potential is, what your personality is. So again, for what to know for the exam, know Rogers and Maslow for the humanistic perspective. There's also culture with self-identity. So this is still a humanistic perspective because it has the person at the center. But a lot of times we forget that kind of what makes us who we are, our culture has a huge impact on it. So there's this whole idea of individualistic versus a collectivistic culture. An individualistic culture is the culture that we are in here in America. And it's the whole idea of the person, the individual. And so a lot of times if you ask someone in an individualistic culture to describe themselves, they'll say, like, I am a caring person, I am a college graduate. They're saying something very specific about themselves. In a collectivistic culture, on the other hand, the emphasis is about their role in their society, in the collective, in the collection. And so they might describe themselves as, oh, I'm John's father. Or they say, I belong to such and such church. So describing themselves more in the way of the groups that they are associated with, as opposed to, who they are individually. And so when it comes to personality and how a person views themselves, it is affected by your culture. Whereas if you see yourself individually, or if you see yourself as a collection or as a part of something. And then just going into that and this humanistic thing, and your personality, self-esteem is a part of your personality and how you feel about yourself and how you see yourself. And you should always see yourself in a positive way, and unfortunately a lot of people don't. But I've gotten the privilege of getting to meet and kind of get to know at least a little bit each and every one of you in class, and I can tell right now that all of you are wonderful individuals. You give me a lot of hope for the future. And so you should see yourself in a positive way. But sometimes people don't have the best self-esteem, and so there's ways that you can build upon it. So acquiring competencies. So sometimes people just feel like they're not good at something. So go out and try new things. Find something that you're good at and, get really good at it. Because that can be a huge boost to self-esteem. Setting realistic, achievable goals. So this goes back to a previous chapter when we talked about sub-goals, where, you have this goal in the future of something that you want to do, but because it seems so far away, it's easy to kind of give up and lose hope. So set sub-goals, set realistic goals of something you can achieve, within a day or within a week, and then within a month, and then within a year. So you can see those improvements and see, that you really are building and growing and, becoming a better and better version of yourself. Enhancing self-efficacy expectations, creating a sense of meaningfulness in your life, challenging perfectionist expectations. So perfectionism can never be reached. You can never be perfect, I guess is what I mean to say. That doesn't mean for you to just give up and say, oh, well, I'll never be perfect, but always striving to get closer and closer, but being okay with the fact that you will never be perfect and that that's fine. Challenging the need for constant approval. So just being happy with who you are based on how you see yourself, not how other people see you. Because those people that, are viewing you in a certain way and are focusing and, see you in a negative way, you don't need those kind of people in your life. And in a similar respect to that, avoiding comparing, again, this is a little dated, Facebook profiles, but just any sort of social media feedback. If there's trolls that are saying negative things about you, a lot of times people take that personally, and you shouldn't. A lot of times they're just trying to get a rise out of people. They're just, trying to put people down. Those kind of people, their opinions aren't worth it. So trying to avoid that. Or, if you can't avoid it, realizing that, they don't know you for you. But anyway, this is just going over what we just talked about for the humanistic perspective for personalities. Again, to know Roger and Maslow for the humanistic perspective is the emphasis for the exam. And then the very last thing is how we test it. Because we've gone over all these different perspectives and all these different ways of explaining what makes you who you are and how you are. But how can we test it scientifically? How do we have a measure? And I know we've talked about like the Big Five, the Cattell personality factors, but there's other tests out there as well, which we're going to talk about. And the first one is the MMPI-2, also known as the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. You'll never guess where it was created. And this is used more for psychological abnormalities in your personality. This is given a lot for, let's say that somebody wants to be a police officer. There are a lot of states that will give this test to them to make sure that, they're not high in like paranoia or schizophrenia. Because you don't want to have, a police officer that has access to a gun and stuff like that, to have, those kind of psychological tendencies. And so this is looking, again, it's a personality test, but more personality abnormalities. And it's hundreds of questions long. I think it's in the 600s, if I recall correctly. So it's a long test, and it's true or false. But the reason why, it's so long is it wants to be accurate in measuring, if there's any of these personality abnormalities. We also have, and this is something that you will be doing in class, it'll be an activity, the Myers-Briggs, which you might have actually already done because I assigned it yesterday, just because I didn't want to have all the activities on one day, because there's another one we're doing today. And this is looking at, there's kind of 4 different dimensions to your personality. There's the extroversion versus introversion, which we've talked about before. Sensing versus intuition, so how you gather information. Do you use kind of more research and, really thinking about something? Or do you just kind of go by your gut and just kind of feeling it? There's the thinking versus feeling, which is very similar to what I was just saying, but more for decision-making. So again, is it going with your gut or going with your feelings? Whereas the sensing and intuition is more how you gather information. And then the last thing is judging versus perceiving for how you relate to the world. And the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the MBTI, looks at where you fall on this, and then you can get one of 16 different personality types. And they go by the different letters. So you can be, kind of looking at this, there's like the ISFP or, ESTJ, it's any combination of those letters, which some of you might have already done. If not, it's an activity that you can do that kind of shows your personality based upon this test. Then we're going to see, if this seems to be accurate for you or not. But that is the Myers-Briggs. And so this also just talks about when we're looking at the different theories that we've talked about. So the psychoanalytical, psychodynamic, trait theory, some of the tests that are out there are the assessment techniques, which are used a lot of times in therapy. So for Freud, you have interviews or projective tests, also with the psychodynamic or neo-Freudians, because again, Freud and neo-Freud are kind of within that same field. Then you have the trait ones where we've talked about some of them, like Attel's 16 personality factors. And the reason why I have this one up here is to emphasize the projective techniques. And so, you have the behaviorism where there's behavioral observations, the sociocognitive, which also has, the behavioral observations, but also interviewing self-reports. You have interviews, self-concept measures for humanistic. But as I was saying, the reason why I wanted to talk about the projective test is this is the last part of what you will need to know for the exam. And there's 2 main projective tests. But if you recall, when we talked about Freud before, and the defense mechanism of projection, it was the whole idea that it was taking these unconscious thoughts that you had that were like reaching your awareness, that you had anxiety about, and projecting it onto someone else or something else. And so these tests are trying to tap into that to see what's going on in your unconscious. And the first one is the thematic apperception test, which was created by Murray, which you will need to know for the exam. And essentially what this does, and you will be doing this in an activity, is you're shown a picture. It's not supposed to, be a picture of, something that you can immediately draw meaning from in a way that, everybody answers it the same way. It's supposed to be very vague. And you're supposed to come up with a story. And essentially, if what's happening right now, how are the characters feeling, what happened to lead to this moment, and then what's going to happen next. And the whole idea, again, because this is a projective test, is that the story you come up with is supposed to kind of reflect upon, what's going on in your unconscious, what's weighing on your mind. So that's one of the ones you will need to know, and you will need to remember the name. So Murray with the thematic apperception test. The other one is the Rorschach ink blot test. And this is a very similar thing, because again, it's a projective test, and you are given an image, but it's more just saying what you see. Because, whereas with the thematic apperception test, it was, a picture of a scene, this is just an ink blot, literally. It's taking ink, putting it on a piece of paper, and smushing it together. Usually in class we make these. Unfortunately, though, we can't do that right now, so I apologize for that. But we are doing an activity with it. And so the whole idea is that whatever you see in this picture reflects, what's going on behind the scenes, when you're unconscious. And that was Rorschach. But that is it. Those are all the things that you will need to know for Chapter 11. We will only have one more chapter left for Chapter 13, which is finally going into psychological disorders, and then we will be done with Unit 4.